So happy to welcome you on behalf of Ellen Foley, who's sitting over here, and Ed Carr, who is right in front of her, and all of us who are part of the New Earth conversation. The conversation Tim and Terry will have tonight, the question they will engage is one that is really unavoidable for us all. It's really the most important conversation of this time, one that we all need to be a part of. Tonight, we're going to listen into that conversation between these two wise people. They'll include us to some extent in it as well, and we'll undoubtedly be able to expand some of our sense of what this conversation needs to be. But please consider it an invitation to take up the question for yourself in conversations one-on-one, in community, whether here at Clark or in a whole lot of other settings in the world, because it is already in our hearts and minds all the time, whether it's conscious or unconscious. That question of how do we live now, given what we know about climate. Through the work we've been doing on the Council on the Uncertain Human Future, and if you want to know more about it, we've got some cards up front that will take you to our website, as well as the website for a New Earth conversation. We've been reckoning with this question for several years in both projects, living into what it means and how it needs to change the life of the university in these times. We're very focused on that. How does this university especially, and all universities, show up for what we're facing and the changes that are ahead? So Ellen and I and many others can say more about that if you're interested. And we'd be happy to talk with you more. So both Tim DeChristopher and Terry Tempest Williams have been living this question for many years. Terry is a naturalist, an activist, and a writer, and she observes, and I always think of as saints of experience. She's been called a citizen writer, one who speaks out on issues of ethics and power, especially in relationship to the natural world and democracy. Her intimate and sensual expressions of oneness with the land and desert quartet were so revelatory to me over 20 years ago that I gave that book to my husband on one of our first dates. I just realized that the other day. She came to Clark for the first time 15 years ago to speak on the open space of democracy. What a powerful event it was. And it was at a time when we also wondered whether our democracy could withstand the sabotage of a corrupt, oppressive system and administration. It was a very dark moment, 2005. We had no idea where we were headed. Her work continues to grow, engaging the heart of where we are and what's at stake. Her grants and awards are numerous, including the Guggenheim. She's taught at the University of Utah, Dartmouth College, and is currently writer in residence at the Harvard Divinity School, where her questions center around climate change. Tim DeChristopher is also an activist, best known as Bitter 70 for his action at an illegitimate Bureau of Land Management auction in Utah for fracking in 2008, for which he served 2 years in a federal prison. His act of civil disobedience provided him a platform which he's used creatively and effectively to bring attention both to the threats on public lands, but to the urgency of the climate crisis as a whole. He organized the climate justice organization Peaceful Uprising in Salt Lake City and is co-founder of the Climate Disobedience Center. He recently graduated from the Harvard Divinity School, and we are fortunate, very fortunate, that he's serving this semester as the inaugural New Earth Conversation Visiting Fellow. And I do also want to mention that we are very fortunate to have this work funded by the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, who's making all of it possible. So, on that note, please welcome Terry and Tim.
for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. I would go wherever you ask me to go.
And thanks to Sarah for organizing this and for setting the container for this at this university and in this community that I think has really been primed for deep conversations about this topic over a number of years of her work. And thanks to all of you for being here tonight as well. Happy spring to everybody. I'm glad that you're all here, not just to witness, but to be a part of this conversation. Terry and I don't have many answers, as you're going to find out tonight. And that's part of why it's set up in this way, for it to really be a conversation, not one directional, but to be this community that is grappling with this question.
And we thought, music, Tim has really taught me that music is such an important part of this moment. Because what do we do with all this energy that we have? And Jim Scott is a hero of mine. And it's so good to see you after all these years. I remember when the Paul Winter concert came to Salt Lake City, and Paul gave a hallelujah, literally hallelujah chorus with the Tabernacle Choir, which was a dream of mine as a young Mormon woman who's no longer active right now. But I know this is putting you on the spot, Jim, but perhaps you could start us with a song to just set the tone, and then we can begin. Yeah.
I could. I just asked that they could turn down the sound system a little because it's feeding back and all that.
Do you want to try this?
I don't think I need that. You're hearing me. Hi, everyone. What Terry's referring to is I played for a long time with the Paul Winter Consort, made a big piece called the Missagaya Earth Mass, and I wrote that and other stuff. Wow, the feedback. Here's a song I wrote to just sing on the street. It's not on one of Jim's albums, but you can find it on YouTube, and I invite you to use it. Make up new verses. Let's see, we are the earth. Oh, that'll work well. And we speak for creation. We will not stand by and watch its devastation. And we will not be bought. Sing that. And we will not be bought. And we will not be deceived. Sing that. We will not be deceived. We are one. We are strong. We are the earth. Sing it again. We are one. We are strong. We are the earth. Yeah, we are the earth of threatened sky and waters. What legacy do we leave to our sons and daughters? We will not be bought. And we will not be bought. We will not be deceived. We are one. We are strong. We are the earth. We are one. We are strong. We are the earth. We are the earth, wounded but unbroken. We will rise when to power truth is spoken. We will not be bought. And we will not be bought. We will not be deceived. We are one. We are strong. We are the earth. We are one. We are strong. We are the earth. We are the earth, diverse and yet united. We will keep on until the wrongs are righted. And we will not be bought. Come on. We will not be deceived. We are one. We are strong. We are the earth. We are one. We are strong. We are the earth. You can make up a verse about anything. I was just in D.C. not too long ago at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And then we are the earth at the home of the president. If you don't smarten up, we're going to get another resident. So you can put anything. We are not be bought. We will not be bought. We will not be deceived. We are one. We are strong. We are the earth. We are one. We are strong. We are the earth. We are more than just dwellers on this earth. We are the earth.
this conversation off just by sort of grounding us in reality, sort of a ground truthing here, because it feels like it's such a disorienting time in our world, where the pace of change seems so quick, and so much is being thrown at us, both in terms of the quickly progressing reality of the crises that we face, and the many, many attempts at deception to confuse and distract us. And one of the pieces of advice that I often give to young people and to others who want to affect change in the world, and they see sort of the systems and institutions that wield power, and they feel like we've got to be inside those systems in order to affect some change. I say, if you're going to go work within the system, make sure you have a lifeline that keeps you grounded to something real outside of that, something that where you can keep anchored and not get lost in the house of mirrors of our institutions and systems. And I think we're all in that, like all of us who are here today, and not like out farming somewhere in a retreat. Like, we are all working within that system and participating in it, and I think we all need that lifeline and that anchor to something real. So I wanted to just start with both of us talking a little bit about what is this place and this time that we are in, and these challenges that we are facing, and the reality of the world around us, and to just ground us that there is something real, and within all of the distraction and lies, and the culture of make-believe around us, that there is something real here, that we are in this room together tonight, in our physical bodies. We are here on this planet that we call Earth, on this land that was traditional territory of the Nipmuc people, that is now land that is part of the American Empire, that is now part of this institution that has some history it can be proud of raising questions about that American Empire, and that we are here in this time where it's 2019, and we've been talking about the climate crisis publicly and openly for well over 30 years now. The scientific community has known about it for far longer than that, and we've done so very little to preserve a livable future on this planet, and it's easy to get lost in the sort of historical amnesia, where we're always a few years away from our last chance in this struggle. I remember when I first got really serious about this work in 2007, the chairman of the IPCC said, what we do in the next 2 or 3 years will determine our future. And that was 2007. And what we did in that next 2 to 3 years was continue accelerating towards that cliff. And we just had a new report come out last fall that said that by 2030, we have to reduce our global emissions by about 50% in order to have a 66% chance of limiting climate change to 1.5 C over historical temperatures, which is still a huge degree of impacts, beyond what we're already seeing the impacts around us, like the cyclone that hit last week and devastated a lot of places, the unprecedented wildfires that we've seen in the past few years, the superstorms, the hurricanes. We're already seeing these impacts, and we know that we've committed to far more, and we're tackling all of this at this moment in 2019, a full century after our society learned so much about how our brains work in human psychology and motivation. And then for the past 70 years, the best and most promising folks in the field of psychology were all recruited into a marketing industry to convince us to use that knowledge of psychology and human motivation to convince us that we are alone and unlovable, and the only thing that we can do to make ourselves lovable is to buy these products and to continue trying to fill the void within us with an ever-increasing supply of consumer goods. And that has really become the cultural context in which we are trying to escape from the consequences that have resulted not only from the ecological crises that have come from that overconsumption, but the social and cultural crises that have come from those tens of billions of dollars a year that have been spent for decades to breed alienation into our society, and have left us with this desperate yearning for belonging that is manifesting in such unhealthy ways that we're seeing with people being pitted against one another and willing to engage in such obviously self-destructive behavior just to define an us against a them. And it's at that moment that we face this need for all of us to be working together for our collective future more than ever, where we are truly everything that we do impacts everyone else on the planet and all those who will come after us. So we are at that moment of crisis on this place, and yet in this region of the world, spring is coming again, despite all of that. I put together a new compost bin this morning. Yesterday I cleared out a couple of vegetable beds, and I'm ready to plant peas tomorrow morning. And so we're reminded of that potential for regrowth, despite all of our faults that have gotten us here. So I'd love to hear from you about where we're at. What is the reality that we're living in this time and place?
I mean, where we're at is right here, now, at Clark University, and I really want to pay my respect, Sarah, to the vision that you have been holding for a long time, and that's why we're here, and we really honor you, and the conversation that you're having about the earth, and about climate with the students that are here, and the faculty, and I find that so powerful and encouraging. Where we are is you and I are in conversation, and I love you. And as I said earlier, you know, Tim is a hero of mine, and he's also a very dear friend. You're a family, you know that. And I love our conversations. We've had them from every place, from in beautiful places to emergency rooms, to you know, in our homes. It's a friendship. It's an ongoing conversation that's really in its 11th year, and I'm so grateful for that. And I think the relationships that you're building now as students are the relationships that will carry you in your lives. And to me, when you ask the question, what is real? It is relationships. It's the relationship I feel with you, Jim, you know, and what we've shared, and how I feel I am more whole because of the voice and your gift that you've put out in the world. You know, it's the conversation we've had around the dinner table tonight. It's the relationships, I think, that bind us to something larger than ourselves. And I think this notion of isolation is what is killing us. And fear of not being able to be our full and deepest and highest selves. And I'm always suspicious when I hold back, when I feel that I can't speak. You know, I know when I I'm in a place that gives me energy, and I know when I'm in a place that takes my energy. And I make note of that. Our body doesn't lie. The earth doesn't lie. I come from Utah. I live in the Red Rock Desert in a place called Castle Valley. To the south are the LaSalle Mountains that are 10,000 feet. There's snow on them still right now. I was just home. To the west is Porcupine Rim. It's a sandstone cliff. If you keep walking, it drops you down into a place called Morning Glory Arch, where wind, water, and time have created this wonderful expanse of stone. To the north is the Colorado River that is running red even as we speak. I just spoke to my husband. I live in an erosional landscape. And to the east is the priests and nuns that every morning when I wake up, they're still there. I love where I live. It is the most frustrating place I've ever known. I was fired from my job because I followed the example of Tim. As you know, Tim bought oil and gas leases and spent 2 years of his life in prison. Civil disobedience. He woke us up. That was real. We had just been talking. We had just been sad. We had just been, we had not acted. Suddenly, a college student named Tim DeChristopher did something. Went into an oil and gas lease. Saw what was happening, the injustices of that, the lies of that, and began bidding up those leases. $1.8 million worth. They realized this is an unusual bidder. This bidder settled. Tim woke me up, and I remember saying thank you. And our lives changed in the state of Utah. That was in 2008. In 2016, with Tim as my example, Brooke and I, my husband, we bought some oil and gas leases legally. But there's consequences, and Tim and I were texting, and I knew that I could not look my friend in the eye if we didn't do something. I knew that. And so we went and bought some leases for $1.50 an acre, less than a cup of coffee. And 2 weeks later, my dean at the University of Utah, where I helped start the Environmental Humanities program, my only ambition in life was to be in Utah. That's where my ground is. That's what's real to me. The dean, I walked in, there was the attorney at the University of Utah, and they said, we want to thank you for your service, and you're no longer teaching. I called Tim, remember? And here I am, we are here. I didn't think about it. It was just the right thing to do. That's what I've learned from Tim's example. We heard Jim's voice. Each of us has gifts. Each of us has a path. We may not know what that is, but when it arrives, we walk it. Zoe is a botanist who makes beautiful pots with the impression of leaves. What is your gift? Where is your community? Where is your place? That is what is real. Right now, where I live, where Tim loves, the Colorado Plateau, America's Red Rock Desert, is under siege. If we had a raven's point of view, it looks like an exposed nervous system. Oil and gas infrastructure, roads, oil pads, fracking lines. Erosion of a different kind. The erosion of justice. You have the Hopi, the Navajo, the Ute, the Mountain Ute, and Zuni nations saying these lands are sacred to us. Bears ears. It's where our prayers are delivered, where our medicine is held, where our people have gathered for generations. Barack Obama heard their pleas, and in 2018 designated Bears Ears National Monument. 1.2 million acres set aside. It was a handshake across history, a relationship developed between Native people and the United States government. Less than a year later, The current president went in with a whisper and a handshake from Orrin Hatch, our senator, who's been there since I was in high school. That is such a long time. Gutted Bears Ears, 85%. Gutted Grand Staircase Escalante by 50%. And it's in the courts now. Social justice, environmental justice is justice for all. A community both human and wild. That is what is real. And I'm interested in a power beyond our own species. What might another kind of power look like? We are not the only species that lives and loves and breathes on this planet. That is what is real. At the Harvard Divinity School tomorrow, they're cutting down a magnificent red oak that has buds to its tips of its branches. Last night we met in ceremony. Tomorrow we will meet in witness. This is real. The reasons that we're cutting down the tree, I do not believe. What do we do with that? Where is our love? Where is our outrage? And can we survive our grief? Those are the questions that are real to me right now.
One piece I want to add to your story of you being fired from the University of Utah, because I think it wasn't just that you went and took that action. I think part of the piece of it was that you brought your students with you. Your students from the Environmental Humanities program were also there in that auction. We're singing, we're disrupting it, we're locking arms on the floor, getting dragged out. And I think that is what truly scared and terrified the university, that their students weren't just intellectualizing things, weren't just talking about what was going on in the world, but they were actually going out and taking a stand. And that you were supporting them in doing so. And that's a radical and disruptive dynamic that we've seen a lot more of since then. And we've seen a lot more of in the past few years with this real upsurge of youthful energy around the climate crisis, and young people really owning their moral authority on the climate crisis, which is at its root a form of violence against young people. Climate change is fundamentally a form of oppression of the young by the old, and those categories, of course, are always shifting. When I came into this work, I was a young person, and now I'm something else, and seeing my role shift a lot. And
what does that feel like?
Complicated, really complicated.
Can you talk about that?
I have. First off, I've struggled to learn how to be an elder, which I think is perhaps a sort of the role that I'm going to have to learn, or the role that I am learning, and that's something that I felt like I lacked a lot of when I was a young activist. You were one of my few real elders, and when I was first asked by the Earth Guardians group, which is a group of teenagers a few years ago, to be on what did they call it? Their wisdom council or whatever, of like, you know, the old people that are supporting these teenagers. I actually asked around in the movement of like, oh, how do I learn to do this? Like, where's the training for being a good elder or a good mentor? What's a mentorship training that I can take? And everybody was like, what are you talking about? We don't train for that. I'm like, well, it shows. And so I am trying to learn how to do that. And like so many others, I'm excited by the youthful energy that is, and the youthful leadership that is stepping up. But there's also something sad or a guilty feeling in me about why it takes youth leadership to step up and say these things that are so obvious to everyone, and to anchor us in reality at this point, and to demand the things that we know are necessary. And this is something that we've been talking a lot about in the Climate Disobedience Center, because most of our core team has at least as much experience in this work as I do. And we had to admit recently that our time in this movement of over a decade apiece has made us increasingly jaded, cynical, fearful, and hesitant. And I think that's why there's that need for youth leadership right now. But it's also a really disappointing thing to acknowledge about our movement culture, that we have built a culture that is teaching each other to be scared and cynical and hesitant, when what we need so desperately now is for people to be open and courageous and unhesitant and experimental, and so I feel a profound sense of responsibility to address that culture, even as I'm trying to support young folks in their path, to address that culture so that we're not just sort of sending them into the movement meat grinder that has chewed up so many of the rest of us. And that's complicated. And it's further complicated by the historical amnesia within the movement as well, that quickly forgets what has come before. And it's difficult to bring up that history of what has primarily just been losses for the climate movement, without being discouraging. Part of the reason that we've grown hesitant as older folks in this movement is that we've tried a lot of stuff that hasn't worked, and so when we hear new ideas, we're like, oh, we already tried that, and we don't want to be that like downer kind of force to young people.
I think about what you're talking about, patience, impatience with change. And, living in an erosional landscape, there's incremental change, the change we never see. How did delicate arch become an arch? And then there's catastrophic change. We just had a huge rock slide that stopped traffic along the river road for 2 days, That's hardly catastrophic, but you get what I mean. It was quick change. And I was thinking, Tim, did you see the law has changed in Wyoming based on the lawsuit? That now when oil and gas leases are put up for sale, they have to have its effect on climate change as one of the criteria. We never thought we would see that. And I think that is exactly the youth movement you're talking about. It's all of the people that have gone to jail. It's the small incremental acts and changes that I think have led to that. Do you disagree?
Again, I think there's a paradox there.
There always is.
Yes,
right?
that is that is positive change, but it's also Secretarial Order 3226 from 2001 that Bruce Babbitt passed that required all the agencies within the Department of the Interior, including the BLM, to consider the impacts of climate change with any of their decisions, particularly when it involved resource development.
But
so
I
we,
think
so we
at
had that
least-
law. We had that law in the books since 2001,
But
and that
at
was
least
part
it's
of.
surfacing again.
Yeah.
Because I think of the change in the air,
Yeah.
I would argue.
Yeah. So I would say it's like both that historical amnesia that has forgotten that in 2001 was when we needed to be taking this incredibly seriously. And yeah, so that's why it's that paradox of sort of celebrating some of that progress.
And also I think realizing, what is courage? To me, courage is sustained focus. It's not one act, it's not this moment of bravado, but it's the sustained focus that I think happens through generations. And again, are we looking at deep geologic time? Are we looking at our time? Again, that's another paradox.
Right.
You talk about amnesia and what we're forgetting. We lost one of our elders, all of us in this country, William Merwin, W.S. Merwin, I think one of the great poets of our time. And, his story is a story of sustained focus and courage. He settled in Hawaii on a burnt piece of land from pineapple. And in the time that he lived there, 60, I don't know how many decades, not long, but by hand he planted palms and created a palm forest, even as he was writing by hand his poems. But one of his poems that I love is, I want to tell what the trees were like. I will have to learn a forgotten language. From your point of view, what is that forgotten language?
I keep coming back to the language of grief for that. I was reminded, I was telling Sarah this, that when we first met and we sat down for breakfast, the first time we ever got together, I started crying like 10 minutes into the conversation and bawled for like 20 minutes. And that has always been like a core part of our relationship.
And I cried with you.
Yeah, is honoring each other's grief of what is being lost, of what has been lost, and of what will be lost. And I think as we've lost that language of grief, and sort of have replaced it with sort of a language of entitlement, and a language of exceptionality, of pretending as if we are not mortal and temporary in this world, that we've lost something about our relationship to the world. We've lost that sense of humility, that sense of vulnerability that I think is at the root of who we are, and we've lost the ability to then hold that paradox that comes from acknowledging that we are all going to die, that everyone we care about is going to die, that everyone we do a nice thing for is still going to die. And yet, it matters that we do those nice things for each other. It matters that we care about each other and love each other. It matters that we live our lives to the fullest, even though we're going to die. And I think in losing the ability to hold that paradox at the center of everything that we do, we lose a lot of important perspective about how to live in this time.
And also what grief really is. You know, I think if we were to cut open grief, what we would find is love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And to me, grief dares us to love again and again and again. And I feel like most of my life I've worn grief as loose clothing.
Mm.
You know, and yet I'm mindful that that is also the clothing of love,
Mm-hmm.
and to not fear that, but to see it again as another erosional agent.
So the community that you're a part of right now at HDS, that I was a part of recently, is in that moment of grief.
It is.
Right now, and that moment of crisis. Do you see any opening for love there in that community?
I do.
Yeah.
I mean,
What does that look like?
Last night was so beautiful. You know, and the night before I was filled with rage. I was angry. You know, it's like I confronted it right here. Not just angry. It wasn't about anger at the divinity school. It was anger at my own humanness. That I cannot breathe or walk without destroying something. You know, angry that I'm part of an institution again that is asking us to compromise our conscience and consciousness, especially at the divinity school, you know. But on the other hand, the students have been in conversation for a year. And they have been gracious, and they have been generous, and they have been civil, and they have talked to the people in operations. They have written letters to the dean. They have talked to organizations such as Black Lives Matter and sat down with them and said, tell us why you're angry with us. And hearing students of color saying, if you cared enough about human beings as you do this tree, maybe we wouldn't be where we are. And trying to talk about, but there is a we. These are really difficult conversations, and I'm seeing those conversations happening. And it occurred to me today that what the divinity tree that is now being called the Mother Oak is actually giving the Harvard Divinity School right now is open space. Because as you know, there is no space.
Yeah.
But now there's a big open space. And a question is occurring, are we going to just now replace this with a big box tree so that you don't have to deal with what was just taken? And the movement is now, 100 acorns or plus were saved and are germinating. Do we have the faith at the Harvard Divinity School to plant those seedlings and not hire a landscape architect that fills in what we've just removed? But to say if we have faith, then 200 years from now, maybe there will be another red oak that now is accompanied with a story. We cannot forget this story. They think it's over. It's just beginning. And I think people are saying, I didn't pay attention. And suddenly they see this magnificent tree in full bloom that is going to be cut. One of the most powerful things I saw was Janet Gyatso, Dean of Students, facing the tree and saying, I am so sorry, I apologize. That was an act of humility. This is a Buddhist scholar who said, ritual is not my thing, but I am responsible. Another woman thought, what can I do? What is my gift? She's a farmer from Maine. She gathered 100 pounds of acorns last fall. And she went to her mentor that is a baker. And she learned how to crush the acorns with the pestle and the, what's it called? Mortar. And made acorn flour and created 100 plus acorn wafers. It wasn't the body of Christ we were eating. We were eating red oak. And she said, we are oak. I haven't seen that at the Divinity School. A woman came with this huge cape, and I thought, well, that's sensible dressing. It was cold. I thought, you know, it's quite exotic. I admired her style. Suddenly, no one knew who she was. She emerged with this magnificent cape, faced the red oak, and went into this unbelievable Italian aria. We had rap. We had a Potawatomi woman with her hands on the tree. All of these things were opening. I had not seen that before. Today, Richard, who works at Ferrari, works at the maintenance. I saw him and he said, Terry, how are the seedlings? I brought them in my truck. I put them in the front seat with me. I don't think they needed the seat belt, but I drove so slowly and I watered them. And they stayed at our house last night. I thought I had to be on my best behavior, you know? I took them to breakfast. I took them back over to operations. And Ralph goes, I don't want to deal with these are too special, you know? And Richard showed up again and said, I know where they live, I'll take them back. And I got this email that said, Terry, they're safe. I have not heard that. Something is shifting. The tree is being sacrificed. But we have elders. And last night, I haven't spoken to this, and again, why are we made to feel that we're crazy? But when no one was looking, when everyone was gone, I put my ear against that heartwood. And as a writer, I know my vocabulary, and it is limited. I deal with it every day. But what I heard come into my heart was, I'm just changing form. I'm just transferring into something else. Just like you. We're learning, so I do see something opening.
Thank you. I think that's an apt centering of where we are right now on a lot of levels. And so much of what's happening to our world is that we are changing into something else. And hopefully planting seeds for what grows up in the place of what is now falling around us. I wanted to invite others into this conversation. If folks have questions or something to add to this, or something that they want to throw into the mix to stir the pot here, a prompt for Terry or I.
Try.
I think that if we were to love the earth as if we were twins, coming from the same mother, having the same blood, perhaps we would stop abusing her. Also, I would like the societies, particularly the Western societies, that are so focused on patriarchal domineering. Fundamentally, we have been brainwashed in abandoning our instincts to adopt a thinking which is, I think, foreign to us. I would like us to go back to the worship of the earth. Abandon all those modes of thinking that are rational what is a religion that consists in worshipping trees and rivers?
Pagan.
Paganism, thank you. Which of course, pagan comes from the word peasant. So a pagan is really somebody who loves his or her piece of land. I think that if we were to go back to paganism, worship the rivers, worship the mountains. I'm from Maine, and in Maine we have a mountain, Katahdin, which is sacred. If we got that feeling that the trees and the mountains and even the pebbles and the rocks are sacred because we all come from the same source, perhaps we might not survive, but at least we would be at peace.
Thank you. Yeah. There's a,
I had some questions over here.
I would just like to respond to that briefly because I think that point about moving away from that system of patriarchy and that notion of domination on which it's based is so integral to this. But I would say that the alternative to that those notions of collectivity and of sharing and of finding our power in our mutuality and in our vulnerability and our strength and our empathy for one another. I would say that that's not entirely foreign. I think that is still innate in us. It is still part of our nature, and you know, I take a lot of hope in the fact that marketing industry that I mentioned earlier has to continue to spend tens of billions of dollars a year, and in ever increasing sums, in order to convince us to go down that path of individuality and of trying to meet our needs through the consumption of material goods, that they didn't complete that task after a generation. That wasn't a lesson that they just told us once and it was done. They have to keep trying to convince us of that, because we have that empathy as a core part of who we are, and that connection to one another, and that desire to be cooperative, and to see that whole web of life that we are a part of as one with ourselves. That's something that has to be continually repressed, as it's been continually repressed throughout history. You know, that in the history of capitalism and colonialism, there has been resistance at every stage, in everywhere that it has gone. You know, from the time that those peasants, whose land was not just their own little piece, the peasants' lands was the commons, that they managed collectively, sustainably, for thousands of years. And it was when the kings colonized that land, the peasants fought back everywhere. You know, there was the German Peasants' War in 1525. You know, just as when that empire then came to the shores of this continent, there was resistance everywhere they went to try to suppress those notions that we can live together without dominating each other, that have been a core part of human nature everywhere around the world, and that continue to demonstrate resilience and rising back up. That I think it's important to recognize that we don't have to look to any exotic or novel places for that spirit of collectivity, that spirit of mutuality. It's within all of us and all of our histories.
And I love that the lead organizer, the student organizer, who's galvanized people around the divinity tree, is a pagan. And she's been very public about it, which I think is interesting. 2 questions over here.
Well, yes, I was a teacher for 37 years, and I taught science, and I also taught a lot of outdoor activities, and starting to teach, I'm now retired, but starting to teach in the mid-70s, and as I taught going into the 80s, and the 90s, and 2000s.
And where did you teach?
Where? I taught at a private school called Wilbraham and Munson Academy.
Okay.
And the one thing I noticed, particularly doing a lot of outdoor activities with the kids, were that kids, I think, and in general, maybe because a lot of people have moved towards urban areas and so forth, we've become disconnected from the natural world. And one of my goals was always to get people to connect to the natural world. Because if you connect to something and you understand it, you appreciate it, you love it, and you want to protect it. But if you disconnect from it, particularly if you're being drawn away by all these material things, it becomes very easy to see nature as just a resource to be used rather than something that you're a part of, something that you need to love and respect and take care of. And so I think that, is part of the 2 ends that are pulling at a lot of modern society today. Their disconnect from the natural world, as well as their being sold that they're going to be happier with all these bigger and better things in their lives. I guess having thought about that, and I started teaching about climate science in 96. I had parents coming in threatening to pull their kids from schools because it was too political, and fortunately I had a headmaster who said that you're teaching science, and he told the parents that, and he told them if they wanted to take their kids out they could, but they didn't. But I've been very frustrated for the 23 years since I started teaching climate science as to what is really going to make things happen and change. And we are seeing a rise, I think, in interest, but we're still not in action. And it's only action that is actually going to address this. And so I guess I've now become a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby, and as you were talking about oil leases and gas leases and all these things, these companies have trillions of dollars invested, not only in the leases and the resources therein, but also in the equipment and everything to sell it. And they do a little greenwashing about, oh yes, we're getting into solar and wind. Yes, it's minute. And they are not going to give up those resources, those trillions of dollars that they've got, unless we get a price on carbon and we begin to make renewable energy competitive with carbon energies. That is, to me, the best hope that I've seen in 23 years of being focused on this subject.
Chris, what are you, Tim, thank you. And off of that, what's your sense of the Green New Deal? Speaking of action and
yeah, I think those are both pushes that have been out there in recent years. They're certainly not exclusive. I think they're complementary. I think the essential point that I come back to all the time is that lobbying is what we do with political power. It's how we wield how we put it into action. But first we have to have political power. And the climate movement still doesn't have that, and never has, which is why we've had such inaction at the political level. You know, on the Republican side, you know, if you say the name Bob Inglis, every Republican knows that Bob Inglis, the former representative from South Carolina, lost his election in 2010 because he was speaking out about climate change. On the flip side of that, there's no one that you can name at that level that has lost their job because they were too weak on climate change. And that really is the heart of political power, the ability and willingness, the proven ability and willingness to take politicians out. And we've never done that. And you know, and so we've always had lots of good ideas on the table, and have never been able to put them into action because we haven't been effective at taking people out and playing that game. You know, that when our opponents play that game, when the oil and gas industry and the coal industry plays that game, they don't care who replaces somebody that stands up to them. They just take them out to demonstrate their power and to show what happens to somebody who doesn't toe the line. You know, and the notion that, oh, you could get somebody worse if you take this person out, they don't care. They care about having every politician be afraid of them. And that's what the left has not had for a generation. You know, we were talking about this earlier over dinner, that, you know, so many of our progressive laws, particularly all of our environmental laws, the creation of the EPA, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, most of our consumer protections, were all passed under Nixon. And Nixon didn't pass them because he was a great guy and really progressive, you know? Like, he passed them because at that time, everyone was afraid of the left. Every politician in the country was afraid of the left. And yet, for some reason, we have this distorted strategic notion on the left that somehow the Democratic Convention of '68 backfired because the Democratic candidate lost the presidency. And so we've been telling ourselves this story that being that bold, that uncompromising, that scary to the political establishment as the left was in 1968 backfired because a Democrat lost. And yet, that's what actually achieved real gains. And so we've been defining success on having somebody in office with a D next to their name instead of defining the real success of actually getting shit done. And have been telling ourselves this twisted lesson for a long time. So I think whatever the solution is that we're pushing, we need to have that willingness to be scary to the political establishment.
Aspirational and inspirational. You know, it's interesting.
I want aspiration and inspiration, but I don't think it's necessary. I think more than anything, we just have to rattle the cage
And I
of
would
the
argue
establishment.
that inspiration and aspiration do that. And talking to
Lots of
John
things do that,
Dingle, who was one of the authors of the Endangered Species Act, who just passed away, I'll never forget meeting him and thanking him for that. And he said, you know, Terry, we didn't have a clue how we were going to do that. We just knew it was the right thing. And I think, and that was true with the water, you know, the Clean Water Bill Act and the Clean Air Act and those that followed. And I think with the Green New Deal, it is an inspirational and an aspirational bill. And when she says, for you, then it touches everyone. It's because I think climate one of the things that's so difficult about it is it's so abstract on one hand. On the other hand, it's not abstract at all. Fire, flood, etc. But it was interesting watching a group of scientists take down the Green New Deal. They had all their charts and figures, and it was economists, politicians, geologists, climate scientists. They just ripped it to shreds and showed all the reasons why it wouldn't work. And then they said, okay, now we did our job, but can we just say it's the first time where we think something really could happen? Because people are inspired, because someone's telling the truth, because, and it just hit me, we think inspiration and aspiration are soft, but in fact I think they're the seedbed of giving us the courage and will and community fire to act. So I think it's this, that, and all of it. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but it's a part of it that I also think we've lost.
And the inspiration and aspiration is happening. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, is that level of mobilization.
And with the young people.
Right. But I think the question that it's going to come down to is the same question that it always comes down to for the political class, which is, or else what? Like we're saying, this is all the stuff we need you to do. And the answer is always, or else what? And the response from the climate movement, the response from the left generally on everything throughout my lifetime, the response has always been or else we'll keep asking. Or else we'll try to vote for some other mediocre Democrat who's slightly better.
So when can we get beyond the us versus them or the left and the right to where it's about human health, it's about planetary health? What is it going to take to get beyond the polarities into actual earth care, health?
I think you have to call your congressman and you have to tell him how you're going to vote, what's important to you, what you expect them to do, and you have to tell your friends and family to call their congressman and tell them how you feel and how you're going to vote and how you want them to vote. It makes a difference. And it takes 2 minutes on the phone line to tell a staff member or someone in the office that in this case it's a bill it's in front of the House right now for carbon fee and dividend. The Energy Innovation Bill is on the House floor and it's coming up for a vote. And you need to tell them, and if you're inspired, pick up the phone and tell them to vote on this bill and how you're going to watch that vote, and your friends and family are going to watch that vote.
And most of us have done that hundreds of times
And we have to keep doing it.
decades.
But I do think it's exciting because if you go to DC right now, and we've been there, all of us, at one point, there are lines all the way around the buildings of people trying to get in. I've never seen it so engaged. And I think that's a good thing. I want to hear from some students.
Student back there.
Yes.
Hi, well, I want to thank you both for coming in. I guess I was just wondering, when can we begin to challenge the lens and the perspective of the Western narrative and understand that for us, crises such as the Michigan crisis, and we constantly talk about our feelings of grief, but when can we begin to understand that there are separate spheres of grief, and there are people and refugees in Burma, Myanmar, who the earth is their home, and we can all say the earth is our home, and we have different understandings of grief and different connections from our childhood and from adulthood and how we connect to the earth as a whole. But when does the conversation really turn from Democrats and Republicans and calling our senators to really being, there are people who really are in desperate needs of help, and understanding that this is not only an environmental crisis, but it's a humanitarian crisis. So how do you encourage students like us to really bring the conversation back and understand that there is a Western perspective that's being enforced, and the dangers of having this hegemonic structure that rules the way that we have daily discourse, not only in classes, but also in the larger world?
Thank you. I think that's a huge part of our challenge is, so sort of like expanding our concepts of grief and the way that we grieve for the full spectrum of the impacts of our actions. You know, to recognize that it's not just personal, that you know, that like after the failure of Copenhagen in 2010, when it became very obvious that we weren't going to stop climate change and that there was going to be a really significant level of impacts that they were now inevitable, and that places like Bangladesh were going to go underwater. You know, we were discouraged from having the conversation about adaptation and mitigate and resiliency, and the conversation about suffering. When there was this sort of unaddressed question of like, what happens now if most of Bangladesh is going to go underwater? What happens to the 160 million people who live there, half of whom live at less than 10 meters above sea level? And we were actually discouraged from having that conversation because there was a fear that it would distract from the continued need to mitigate what could be mitigated. And yet that conversation was happening somewhere about what to do, because in the years after Copenhagen, India built a 1,900-mile partially electrified border fence all the way around Bangladesh. You know, that was in 2010, and they're obviously a very close ally to us, so when they make a big geopolitical move like that, obviously they talk to our Secretary of State at the time. And so somewhere there was a decision made that people were complicit with, that those folks are going to stay right where they're at so that they don't inconvenience the rest of us. And so the need to, I think, emotionally connect with that broad range of suffering that is going on right now from the climate crisis, and from the generations of impacts that will suffer, is one of the areas where I think we need to emotionally grow the most. And that might take the creation of new rituals, it might take some experimentation. I'll just briefly tell the story of one attempt that we had to try to grapple with that, and that was in 2016. In May of 2016, there was a story in Reuters about Pakistan digging anticipatory mass graves in anticipation of the heat wave that was coming, because the year before, the heat wave was so unprecedented that they were left with thousands of bodies with nothing to do with them. And even as someone who has paid very close attention to this stuff for a long time, that story just really broke my heart in a whole new way. And to me, being at that stage of the climate crisis, where we entered the age of anticipatory mass graves, seemed too significant to turn away from as a milestone of grief, because of what mass graves have meant for our civilization. And when I looked at the pictures of this trench that they were digging in Pakistan for this mass grave, it suddenly struck me that it looked exactly like the trench that they were digging through West Roxbury at the same time to lay a new natural gas pipeline. And of course those things were connected, that if we're already at that advanced stage of climate crisis, then that means every new piece of fossil fuel infrastructure will lead to another mass grave somewhere in the world. And so I reached out to a lot of my friends who were actively fighting that pipeline and were in the midst of an ongoing campaign of civil disobedience to stand in the way of it. And I said, I feel like we need to witness this moment of what was happening in Pakistan and connect the dots to what was happening right here in Boston. And we need to find a way to stand with this grief. And we talked with a lot of the religious leaders that were a part of that campaign. And I said, this is an opportunity to practice your mass graves eulogies. And so we ended up having this, this big interfaith gathering there on the street where the construction was happening, where we were trying to hold both the grief for what was being lost in Pakistan and the need to resist the ongoing destruction for wherever the next mass grave might be. And we tried to hold those two at the same time. And the police had a big line, barricade there to prevent us from getting to the trench. And we held that grief ceremony in the morning. And we're so weighed down by the grief that we couldn't maneuver around the police at that moment. So we had to retreat and go back to the church and re-strategize. And then we came back an hour or two later with much more vigorous energy and ran around the police and got into the trench and shut down the work for the rest of the day, and laid our bodies in the trench the same way that those bodies had been laid in the trench in Pakistan. And for me, and I think for a lot of the others that were laying our bodies in that trench, which was like 6 feet deep, and we were looking up this trench at the people who were walking past, it was a profound moment of holding that grief and of trying to emotionally connect with those lives that were lost on the other side of the world. But it also felt like we've got a lot of work to do to learn how to do this better. And so I just offer that as a definitely flawed experiment of trying to grapple with that territory.
What ways can you use empirical data to really understand the immediacy and the temporality of this kind of suffering, environmental racism, and environmental ignorance that we see going on in the world? And how can we use science and work with scientists in this realm of, again, usage of empirical data to show that it is necessary, but also not fall into the traps of institutions and seeing that these structures do create cyclical violence, and these institutions hold this kind of structural violence that is in continuation. So I guess my wraparound question is, how do we understand the immediacy, and how do we work with empirical data to solve the problem at hand?
You know, one thing I would encourage you to look at the Planetary Health Alliance's website. They are literally going country to country, county to county, with training of exactly that, looking at the empirical data of disease and climate and lack of biodiversity and its effect on human health and the health of water and these systems and the interconnectedness of it all. I think it would be of note. And my question for you, tell me your name. I'm Julia. Julia, what moves you? With the questions, with the depth of question that you're asking, what moves you? Where do you see yourself in this, inside your own question?
For me, I have a connection to Worcester. I grew up around 20 minutes from here, and as someone who grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood with safe parents, safe family, safe house, I have grown up in a realm of security, and coming to college and being exposed to these academic articles and seeing the violence and the crime, just the suffering and the lack of insurance that our country has given these other countries, I didn't even know how to respond, because I'm sitting here in these four safe walls and being able to read these articles and discuss it in comfortableness, and then walk out and go eat lunch and go talk to my friends. And I guess just the level of my own ignorance is what really drives me. And unfortunately, as a first year, I found myself not consuming enough knowledge. And so I hope to just learn more and be more aware and understand that
Another student? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm a doctoral student in geography, and I'm starting to work on my dissertation soon. I'm studying. Can you hold the microphone? Sure. I'm a doctoral student in geography. I'm starting to work on my dissertation soon, and what I'm studying is something called eco-district planning in Pittsburgh.
The what?
In Pittsburgh.
Yeah, but what, I missed the first one.
It's called eco-district planning.
Okay.
And similarly to how this conversation started out, it's a form of governance, community governance, where people are trying to think about the place where they are, their neighborhood, and how to change their immediate context. And they're attentive to the meaning of the small meaning that imports that, as well as the material components of the environment and the built environment and the way those things are related in their neighborhood. And I'm really interested in that. Theoretically, I'm working with scholarship that's talking about, that recognizes the value of that, and also posits that it's important for efforts like that to scale up to broader areas and also broader levels of governance. And that is, this concept of scaling up is something I've been thinking a lot about and trying to wrestle with my own way in my project, particularly if place is something that's already networked and connected in the ways that we're talking about. What does it really mean to scale up, or is scaling up the most useful way to think about it? And so I just wanted to offer it as a question because I'm really curious about your thoughts on this idea of scaling from these places and these moments, and what you think about that, or other ways you may think about that.
That's getting all kinds of wheels turning for me. That's an exciting question. I mean, one of my initial reaction is to be leery of the notion of scaling up and of just supersizing everything. You know, I think there are to really be guided by ecology and by the way that nature works. You know, things don't just like scale up into like one big organism. You know, things spread out and they interact and they mutate as they spread. And so I think that is something that's important for a model like this, where, you know, Pittsburgh is a unique place. I grew up there, and it strikes me that it's perhaps an example of what you're talking about at the beginning of this conversation, of things sort of falling apart and creating the open space for new things to sprout up. In reaction to certain kinds of hardship there. You know, when I was growing up there in Pittsburgh, it was kind of the in-between time where like nobody knew what was next for Pittsburgh, where the older folks, you know, could all tell the stories of how, you know, a couple decades earlier, all the businessmen would bring an extra white shirt to work when they worked downtown, because by lunchtime their shirt would be so black and covered with soot that they'd have to change it into a new one, that it was that dirty of a town. And I left right before the fracking explosion set its sights on western Pennsylvania, and created a whole new kind of assault on that place. And so you know, some of the really exciting stuff that has been happening in Pittsburgh over the past decade or so, you know, where they were one of the first cities in the country to ban corporate personhood in their city, which they banned at the same time that they banned fracking within the limits of Pittsburgh. You know, that groundbreaking stuff there, and those kinds of experiments of looking for a healthier, more sustainable way to live and to govern their community grew out of that unique hardship and threat that area faced. And so I think those stories of place and that local history is critical to weaving that in with whatever solutions are going to be right for a place. That we need to have that ecology means being rooted in that network, which has to be diverse in order to be healthy. And so rather than just scaling up those solutions, I think the question is like, how do they evolve in relationship with the other places that they're spreading?
I wonder if could I possibly relate, I'm sorry to jump in, but to relate Pittsburgh to all you environmentalists of Worcester, what is happening in Worcester right now, this giant project right over here, Worcester's going to have a baseball stadium. And there are meetings going on now, the activists of town and community, if you don't know about it, I invite you to be, and we've got 4 months to create a community benefit agreement, CBA, with the multi-million dollar developers of this stadium. It could be a green stadium. It could employ local people. It could employ a diverse workforce, people of color, all of those things. We have to demand that. And ordinary people don't have any power, but if we get together, as is happening, if you'd like to see it, it's very inspiring. The Worcester Community Labor Coalition, and I'm in the NAACP, which is part of that, and the unions, and so on like that. This is what's going on right now. We have 4 months before July when shovels go in the ground, and if we don't get that CBA, community benefit agreement, we've missed it. And the millionaires will get richer. All kinds of things will happen here. We'll have a lot of cars with other license plates on them, the workers that come here because we didn't employ the local people. We could make this a model to the whole country, to the world, ecologically, morally, and we got 4 months. Just thought I'd bring that in, kind of like the story of Pittsburgh.
You know, I think, thank you, Jim, and your name is Sarah. You know, and the comments here, you know, I think one of the themes of tonight's conversation has been engagement, the importance of engagement, the importance of voting, the importance of civil disobedience, the importance of action, research, hands on the earth, remembering that forgotten language. And I think one of the things you're talking about, Sarah, of scaling up, you know, to me, before we scale up, we have to really pay attention and listen to what's here. You know, and Pittsburgh's such a beautiful city in terms of this confluence of rivers. You know, what is the land telling us? You know, I go back to Merwin. You know, I want to tell what the trees were like, but I will have to speak a forgotten language. That language that we have forgotten can be retrieved through remembering, through listening, through observing, through being present, and being attentive, and that takes time. You know, so often people will say, you know, you should talk to 1 million people. I don't know what 1 million people even means. You know, when they say on the internet, you know, it's like, I know what this means. And this is that sense of intimacy. So, as a researcher, you know, how can you bring your attention to this place? How do you listen? Who are the local people? Who are the native people? Who are the ethnic people? You know, what are those stories? And then, what does the land itself ask of you? And I think that's the humbling, that's the kneeling, that's the gesture required. And then to engage. And I think we're all asking what that means. And it requires love, it requires grief, it requires community. And that commitment to be vulnerable, to have your heart broken, and to continue.
Amen.
Thank you.
Did you want to say anything else, Tim? That was such a
Beautiful way to conclude this conversation.
And Tim has a song we can frame this evening
Yes.
with a song?
Yeah. I've been sort of on a retreat for the past week with a lot of activists that I work with, and this song became something that we sang to each other a lot. That I feel like is really related to this conversation, where we don't have a lot of answers, and why that's necessary to be willing to sit without answers in order to know where we're at and where we're going. The lyrics of this song came from a Wendell Berry poem, and I forget the name of the artist who wrote the music to it. But the song is, "To go in the dark with a light is to know the light. To know the dark, go without sight, and find that the darkness too blooms and sings, and is traveled by dark feet and dark wings."
Thank you both so much for this time together and for opening spaces that we had not been in before. May we continue to do this in all kinds of ways and to continue a conversation next week with Tim. A week from tonight, we'll be having a conversation at the Higgins Lounge with Susie Moser and Tim also in this open-ended way about how do we live now given what we know with climate. So thank you all so much for being here. Please come back.
Thank you.